Please ask. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I guess I turned on recording. Am I correct?
Yeah, the recording's going, so you don't have to do anything. But do you have some slides that you want to share?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, just a sec. Okay. Okay, so this is what I kind of prepared for today, and I thought we could maybe discuss. This is rather the collection of some ideas about dividing space. And this question, sharing or dividing, this is kind of word game, especially in Polish, it sounds a little bit different, but referring to in general vegan philosophy, this philosophy would kind of impose this imperative of not harming other species and not really intervening or dominating other species, with building different kind of structures which can be interpreted as fences. We do intervene in environment. But the question which rises here, I think, is the question, what is actually natural environment? And the first picture that you see on the first slide is one of these walls that you can fold, and you can create the wall, and then you can kind of make it disappearing. So depending on the needs, the wall is there, or the fence is there, or it's not there. And it may seem to be artificial environment, meaning not natural, not something like woods or the meadow or something like this. But the question which comes here is the question which would be raised by from the background of what Rossi Braidotti proposed, culture and nature continuum, where she says culture is kind of biologically inherited or biologically rooted phenomena which is created by humans, but this is a form of adjusting to the environment, and on the other hand, changing environment to make it more suitable for human needs. So on one hand, of course, what we have on this picture, this is cultural invention, cultural creation, but on the other hand, thinking about continuum where culture is linked with nature and culture is treated as form or element of human nature, this can be also analyzed as natural environment. But of course, when I speak about natural environment, I mean more natural environment, meaning not cultural establishments and not cultural creations. So when I think about fences in general, fences and walls and these kind of structures, the first reason to explain why we create them is, of course, the need of safety. And this, as Abraham Maslow would state, is one of the basic needs, but not only for humans, also for other species. Just a remark on the margin, if my dog starts to bark, I have to break for a second because, they scream much louder than I can talk. So I apologize for this in advance. Okay, so I think this safety need is something what makes us creating different kind of, let's say, obstacles, structures, divisions in the nature, and they are meant to provide safety. This is not only biological function, it may have also in case of humans, different functions like social, psychological, self-identification, self-expression, but also oppression. So of course, the primary function is defense and safety, but then some other, so to say, cultural functions also come to the picture when we speak about fences created by humans. Fences as such, or barriers, physical barriers as such, are not typical only for humans. Here we have some of the examples of different forms of fences, so to say, which are meant exactly for what I said before, for providing intimate, safe space for basically for breeding. So we see various forms of nests created by insects, also mammals, also birds. some other species as well. So in a way, creating barriers, physical barriers, is embedded in the animal nature. So if we think about human as an animal, of course, we have this form of existence and self-expression as well. However, we create forms of divisions in space which are meant to serve our purposes also by kind of oppressing animals. And when we look at agricultural fencing, which would be, I think, one of the best examples of use of fencing, we want to keep livestock in, meaning we want to limit them from getting outside, which means we want to limit their need of exploration and movement and, well, maybe searching for some kind of environmental enrichment. In some cases, of course, one can say that keeping livestock inside of the fence is meant to provide safety in terms, for example, of dividing them from predators. But on the other hand, we can discuss if this is really something what these animals need for the welfare, for general welfare and well-being in their lives. So this is one sort of idea of fencing animals and dividing space in which we limit needs of animals. And then, of course, we want to keep wildlife out of the area and where this livestock is kept. So here again, we limit needs or fulfillment of needs of the wild animals, for example, that need to get food by hunting sheep or something like this. So these two ways seem to be present in agricultural fencing. We see a lot of different types of fences, so we could really discuss this widely in forms like which forms are being created and what kind of forms are interesting. I have chosen, I listed some of them here on the slide, but I thought maybe interesting ones are two. The upper picture, these are the bars, the metal bars, panel bars, which are used to limit the movement of sheep from one meadow to the other meadow, and they are placed on the ground. Animals see these bars and they interpret the background as something what is dangerous, as something what is not stable, especially if the light goes through it. So they see shades and stripes of light, and they would not cross this. So this is one of these kind of fences, so to say, which is not really a fence as we know it, you know, like not the picture that immediately comes to our mind when we think about fence, but this is some kind of physical barrier which stops animal from crossing, you know, to the space which we humans don't want them to be in. And the other example, this lower one, this is Fladra line. This is actually Polish, Russian, Ukrainian sort of invention. Well, in fact, I don't really know which country it comes from, but for sure this is the region where Fladra lines are used, and Fladra lines are stripes of ribbon or some kind of fabric being attached to the string, and this string is meant to be kind of like a fence, and Fladra lines are used on one hand to hunt wolves, not in Poland because this is forbidden here for this moment, but in other countries by using Fladra lines and kind of surrounding wolves in Fladra, hunters hunt them, but also they are used to protect livestock, meaning to keep wolves outside of the stock of the sheep or goats, smaller animals. These moving parts of the fabric are very scary for wolves. So although this is not stable barrier, it's not something which we would not imagine that we could cross. For animals, it's just a barrier that they would not cross. And I have seen movies recorded by the traps, observing wolves trying to get to the meat of the animal in Fladra, in the area surrounded by Fladra. And although wolves would be trying to get in there, they would not get there. They are so scared that they don't go inside of this area. So this is another example of defense which is not so obvious, and we kind of use it to limit the movement of animals. Of course, we can speak also about forest and highway fences. Forest fences are a huge problem because they are being used widely now in the forestry to protect plantations of young trees, which are being eaten by deers especially. But by imposing fences of this form, animals are pushed outside, so they cannot get food from their natural environment, natural type of plants, and they have to go outside, meaning to the fields, agricultural fields, which of course causes what is being called by farmers as losses. And then this is justification for hunters to hunt these animals and basically kill them. Highway fences are also a very interesting subject, and of course they are kind of thought as barriers that are meant to prevent safety of animals, but the primary function is to provide safety for drivers, not for animals. And we see a lot of cases of injuries, even fatalities of animals trying to cross these fences. There are exits, there are bridges for animals being constructed. Much more effective are bridges than the ways which go under the highways, as animals are afraid of this noise which is made by cars driving on the highways. So they don't want to kind of approach the tunnel, and they don't want to go. They are afraid of these noises. So these are two other interesting forms of fences. And the classical examples of fences which were installed and were widely criticized are three, well, actually are two examples from Australia, but I also wanted to add the third example from Poland. So the most classical is a dingo fence, which was built in the end of 19th century, the longest barrier on earth, basically, which was created to keep animals outside of the area, which was identified by humans as something where dingo dogs shouldn't be present. This was this lower western part of Australia where farming was developed and production of sheep was developed. So in order to protect farmers' sheep basically from being eaten and being hunted by dingo dogs, this fence was created. Fence was not effective. Dingoes have managed to go through it. Although, of course, this was a barrier which would make migrations much more difficult for them. And also division of this kind have created overgrowth of kangaroo and rabbit populations, which were competing with sheep for grass, for food. So it may be seemed at the beginning like this kind of idea to eliminate dingoes from certain areas is good idea, but it actually was not. Except of fence, there were other additions, so to say, used, like poisoned bites, which were placed along the fence. So this is kind of, I would say, metaphorically extended fence, where the fence as such is a physical barrier, but then it's the poison is added and kind of sums up with this let's say effectiveness of the fence. The second one was the rabbit-proof fence, and this is the also Australian example. The problem, so to say, with rabbits appeared because in 19th century British settlers hunters decided to introduced small population of 24 rabbits for hunting, just for fun. This population spread and reproduced widely, so it created a major problem with population. And was the fence effective? No, it was not effective. So finally, in order to sort of deal with the problem of growing population of rabbits, there was introduced the virus which caused lethal disease, which basically eliminated rabbits. So again, we have another example of the fence which was not effective. And here we have the third case, which is the Polish case. Actually, two cases. We have now barriers, the fences, preventing a spread of African swine disease. And these fences were created on both western and eastern borders of Poland. The western one was initiated by the German side, which was afraid of spread of African swine disease. The eastern one was initiated by the Polish government, and this fence very quickly became a tool for operation which stopped migration, which was meant to stop migration of illegal, so to say. I'm putting all of these in the brackets. So illegal migrants coming from Belarus and Ukraine. Very easily, this form of division, space division, was used from preventing animals to cross, and kind of used for preventing humans also to cross the borders. It's extremely difficult now to find exact data on how many kilometers of these fences were built, how much it costed. It's basically impossible to get it. As probably all of you know, we have authoritarian right-wing government in Poland, which follows classical sociological authoritarian, rules and methods of ruling the country. So this form of oppression is one which would fall in this classical authoritarian way of thinking about how we can prevent ourselves from the threat from outside. I think we can also see here a lot of psychological and sociological links and kind of, let's say, ideas to discuss, as the one I have mentioned before about authoritarian thinking, how to divide space. Also, this concept of kind of inadequacy between creating physical fence or physical wall or physical barrier in order to stop things like, spread of the virus, where this kind of ideas seem to be absolutely inappropriate, and it doesn't seem like they may work even from rational point of view. I also see here the link between this idea and one of the speakers before, I think Linda, spoke about animals being guilty for some kind of behaviors and some kind of situations. So here, this authoritarian government tried to accuse boars for the spread of African swine disease, although scientific research showed that this is humans who really spread the virus. So I could speak about this kind of things a lot. I see a lot of, the more I think about these fences and barriers, the more ideas I kind of find. So I would be also interested in, how you see this and what do you think about, for example, yesterday when I was thinking about this presentation, I thought about fishing net as kind of a fence which is used, which is movable, which is, but also used in the same way, right? To kind of oppress animals that we want to just eat. On the other hand, I just don't want to defend this idea, but it's the idea that comes to my mind. We are the species that also needs some kind of food and some kind of domination over the space and over other species. If we compare this biologically, if we use this biological background to, for example, I don't know, wolves or maybe chimpanzees, which also eat plants, but sometimes they eat other animals, insects and small animals. So sometimes I think about human being and human species as, invasive species, so to say, although I know that this is cultural category, but when we speak about invasive species, can the human be interpreted as invasive species, which kind of spreads all over the world and, kind of destroys the world and destroys, equals, adjusts the world to the needs that we have. So I leave this open, but the more I think about this, the more ideas I see. So maybe this will be also inspiring for you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hanna. That was really interesting. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions at this point. I do have a question that I'd like to jump in with if no one else does, but do you want to raise your hand if you also have a question you would like to ask? And perhaps while people are gathering their thoughts, Hanna, I was thinking about the examples you talked about earlier of animal fences around like nests and things like that. And I know that there's a book I read a little while ago on animals as property owners and the idea that animals can kind of set up property ownership spaces and private spaces for themselves. So while you were talking about fences, I thought, I kind of think fences for other animals are really rubbish and they're very problematic. But then I think about if animals set up boundaries around themselves, do you think animals' fences should be respected? And if so, how would we start to go about that?
I don't know. I have a problem with this. I don't know. I don't know where to stop, where to put the sort of limit of fencing and creating fences. I guess the problem with us is that it's overpopulation, that we dominate the world and we kind of abuse this concept of dividing space. I see this in my village where, you have more and more houses being built and all of them are surrounded by fences. So wildlife which lives here and which we admire, and this is why we moved into this village, they just are pushed, away because, the fences are all over. So I don't know, I have a problem with this. I also have a problem with things like invisible fences, which are especially popular in the United States. I don't know if in your countries. In Poland, we don't really have it, but I've seen this a lot in US. And invisible fence is basically electric fence, which is hidden underground, and the dog wears a collar, which kind of, if the dog gets close to the line, how do you say, sends the electric impulse. So in a way, we do it for the safety, but at the same time, we harm animals that we love, that we share houses with. So, I have problems with this. I don't really know. I don't really have exact answer how to interpret these things and how to follow this. But yeah, to a certain extent, I guess we have to respect these barriers created also by other species. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to live with us.
Absolutely. No, thanks very much for that. It's really interesting. And I can see some comments in the chat as well that will be good to look through a little bit later on to put up for us.
Yes, of course. Just a moment. Can you see what I see?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Is it full screen for you as well? Yeah, you're nodding, Alan. Great. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for waiting such a long time to listen, I think, to the last presentation of the whole conference. My name is Adrianna Kapek-Goodridge, and I am a PhD researcher at Huddersfield University. I did tweak my presentation a little bit, so don't be surprised what comes out of it. But firstly, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Norbert Elias and the civilizing process. And I know we are, well, most of us probably here are sociologists and are familiar with many different theories, but I'm looking at farm animal welfare governance through the lens of the civilizing process. So just a little bit more about Norbert Elias. So he explores civilization through a normative evaluation of sociogenesis and an empirical examination of psychogenesis. So basically, sociogenesis considers the development of cultural and civilizational concepts through which society started to see themselves as more civilized than others, so civilized inverted commas, of course. In this process, the societies became civilized for self-proclamation, which turned into a sense of superiority and resulted in a movement towards civilizing other groups of people, such as the lower classes of their own society or the natives of colonized lands. So this progress was considered superior. So towards civilization, you are civilized, you are more superior, as opposed to someone who is barbaric, primitive, and uncivilized ways of life. Whereas psychogenesis makes connections between changes in standards of behavior and changes in state formation processes. And Elias collected the empirical evidence, and it was crucial for illustrating ways in which behavioral norms and psychological makeup of the individuals arise and change. So basically, the civilizing process is concerns kind of the relationships between people, and I am looking how it concerns the relationships between people when we are looking at non-human animals, their suffering and sentience, but we will get to that in a minute. So the long-term transformation of psychological makeup he calls habitus, and it's basically manners that are an ever-changing and constantly improved notion. It's a movement towards many things no longer being spoken about, and it runs in conjunction with a movement towards moving many of the same things kind of behind the scenes of social life. So people, as they become kind of more civilized, they have this growing aversion to violence and brutality, and they experience embarrassment when they are looking at certain things that start to offend them, but at the same time they put them behind the scenes of social life. So even though people claim that they are offended by something, they will just put it somewhere else behind those scenes so that their newly found sensibilities are not offended. So of course, this increase in experiencing embarrassment, shame, and repugnance towards bodily functions is also a process that illustrates that constant change of people's sensibilities. So it's a lot about changes in attitudes and then how they influence relationship and interdependencies between people. So it's also, this habitus, it also includes shifts from external restraints, so control by others, to self-restraints, which is control by self. But we also have decivilizing processes. So Elias explains it as regression to barbarism, decivilizing spurts, or regression from earlier standards. And it's basically creating more distance between ourselves and the offensive act. So Elias gives a good example of the Holocaust, of how that could be considered a regression to barbarism, and how we kind of put so many tools between us and the act of killing. So before, let's say 500, 600 years ago, a brawl at the bar would be maybe acceptable, and people would not be as offended by it. But then with state formation and monopolization of power, it would be more kind of offensive. You would actually face consequences if you were just to go and hit someone, especially now. After so many centuries, we have all these different laws forbidding us to cause harm to another human being, and there are all these human rights atrocities that can happen, but at the same time we are putting so many kind of items and so many different things between us and that act of killing, especially in warfare. We can see the development with drones and everything else, that we are just stretching that distance between us. But when it comes really close, when we are killing people, and when we are kind of doing things that are considered to be uncivilized, we can see how that kind of comes into the same context, and it's regression to barbarism, as for example Elias showed with the Holocaust. Now what I'm working on when it comes to, well, we're only going to be looking at it from the theoretical perspective because it's an awfully long thing, and I always get too carried away with it. So I'll focus just on the animal civilizing process, which is something I'm working on, and then wondering whether it could be a new direction for figurational sociology. So basically Norbert Elias and the civilizing process. So as we know with Norbert Elias now, we have this kind of idea of the civilizing process. He does not consider human and non-human relations. So there is this big gap in his work that I am exploring. So I am looking how basically relations between people are influenced by our attitudes towards non-human animals. And when I say animals, I always mean non-human animals. I don't mean all of it. So just don't be thrown off by this, because saying non-human animals is always a mouthful every single time. So animals is non-human animals, and humans and people are people. So I'm looking at this general European process in ways that humans perceive non-human animals. And animal is in inverted commas because it does not refer to relations between animals themselves, but between people. So it's how we perceive each other based on our attitudes towards non-human animals. So how these perceptions of animals are changing through shifts in human attitudes and their figurations. And of course, there is a gradual change in approaches throughout the centuries, but some animals are treated differently. So those that were more useful, like hogs, horses, or dogs, were treated with a little bit more respect, maybe, and people would give them a little bit more consideration because these sensibilities were changing alongside these changes. But of course, there are ambivalence in attitudes. So like I've mentioned, for example, we have, well, maybe I haven't mentioned that, but we have more and more people who consider or who care about human rights atrocities, who care about war and slavery and human trafficking. At the same time, we have more slavery, more human trafficking than ever before within that civilizing process when we're talking about human interdependencies. But when we are looking at the animal civilizing process, it's the same ambivalence. We have more animal welfare movements, there are more vegetarians and vegans, there is more activism, but at the same time, more and more animals are being slaughtered for human consumption each year. And it is the same ambivalence and recognition of animal sentience. So we have so much research into emotional and cognitive capabilities of animals, but at the same time, we have a lot of animal testing for both for research and cosmetic industries and so on, which are very difficult topics to tackle. So it is basically this kind of massive European figuration. It's a whole process that goes forward, but can also regress. And what that means is, as I showed with the decivilizing spurts and Elias shows with Holocaust, we can see that even though we have more and more vegans and vegetarians and movements and NGOs, we also have more industrial farming and more animals are being killed each year for human consumption. So we can see that there are these similarities between kind of the human civilizing process and the animal civilizing process. But at the same time, it is very difficult to talk about the animal civilizing process as a whole because it is a very, very, very big figuration. So we have this smaller figuration of animal welfare governance, and it's something that I'm working on kind of these relationships between NGOs, governments, retailers, and consumers. So these are the kind of interdependencies within the figurations that I'm looking at by using the lens of Norbert Elias in the civilizing process. And of course, we can see that there are different levels of attitudes to farm animal welfare. And at this point, I tend to show kind of this little iconograph which basically shows the attitudes of European citizens towards farm animal welfare. Poland is always somewhere there at the bottom because people seem not to care as much as other countries, and the UK seems to be going a little bit further, a little bit higher than other countries. So that's why I have chosen Poland and the UK as case studies. And even though I will not go into the depth of it, I will just touch on the theory of it. I think it's important to point out that because this kind of civilizing process is a lot about attitudes and sensibilities and changing these attitudes and sensibilities, it's important to see what these level of attitudes are in different countries. And that's why I looked at the European developments and then kind of focused them on Poland and the UK. Now, the outsider NGOs that are challenging the balance of power set by the established government, well, that's kind of outsider established relations is another kind of Elijah idea. So basically those people who are dissatisfied with the outcome of action at, it can be national or European levels. In this case, we have the kind of dissatisfaction with the national governments. So they are these outsiders, they form the NGOs, and then they challenge the established government to maybe increase or improve their existing farm animal welfare legislation, which does not always happen. It's not always successful. So the NGOs tend to either endorse or develop their own private standards. So we have, Compassion Inward Farming and let's say Humane Society International, and they are trying to kind of do their best and maybe develop some kind of their own private standard and go on about improving farm animal welfare in their own way because their governments are not able to do so. And especially in the UK, there are various factors that influence how these NGOs operate. And it can be food scares like mad cow disease, it can be agri-food movements and so on. But to be more effective, NGOs legitimize their agenda through establishing relations with retailers. And that is a very unique discourse when we are talking about kind of the European figuration. And like it's called kind of the ethical complex. So it's just it's a concept. It's not a real thing that happens. It's a concept that, you know, it can be illustrated by how these NGOs actually form the relationship with retailers because of these different factors like food scares in the UK. So the ethical complex, it basically helps the British NGOs to establish relationships with retailers, and because of that, these retailers can influence consumers in different ways, because retailers in the UK have always been influencing consumers in various ways, like giving recipe books and advertising and so on, and they are very kind of conscious about their PR image, and that is quite a unique thing for the UK as well, when it's not for Poland, for example. So it works totally different for Poland as well. But I'm looking how this ethical complex, whether it's there in Poland and how it happens, you know, how NGOs influence retailers, whether they influence them at all, and then how they influence consumers in turn. So I'm doing this whole investigation into Polish figurations of farm animal welfare. But I don't tend to kind of talk so much about my data analysis, even though it's very interesting, because talking about farm animal welfare, it's just such a broad topic, and I focus on fish welfare mostly. And in Poland, as many of you may be aware of, you know, CAP for Christmas and so on, and it is quite a big topic. But when we are talking from kind of sociological point of view, and, you know, Norbert, Elias, and the whole civilizing process, I tend to focus on this animal civilizing process and how we can see that not only kind of Norbert, it's kind of the last slide, it's like the summary that Elias's theory kind of gives us this great foundation to explore people's attitudes towards animal suffering, and then also how then these attitudes influence relationships and interdependencies between people. And within various societies. So we can see that it can be a big figuration, like a whole massive European figuration of just a general animal civilizing process, people changing their attitudes from not caring about animals as much, and then caring about maybe some working animals, and then caring more about their pets. And then we are in the situation we are in, like when Lucja was talking about grief and death, how far we have come when it comes to, let's say, European societies with our attitudes, to even caring as far as farm animal welfare, farm animals and their welfare. And it's interesting to see when I was talking about putting this distance between us and the act of killing, we can see that with people. And like I've mentioned before, you know, we consider so many human atrocities, and especially now with war in Ukraine, and how many organizations are trying to kind of ensure that human rights are being kept. Yet we have so much of this killing going on, we have so much slavery and human trafficking, and it is the same with animals, and this kind of the same civilizing and decivilizing process goes on when we have come as far as just going to a supermarket and buying a piece of meat and not even realizing and not even thinking about what happened before. We are so disconnected with that kind of act of eating meat that we have, because we have so many tools and such a big distance between us, because it started to offend people. This kind of abattoirs in the streets, they started to offend these newly civilized sensibilities, and therefore slaughterhouses were pushed away from views, and they are there in, you know, in the villages or somewhere away. And, you know, this concept, this whole civilizing process, it can be applied to so many different things. But of course, you know, even migrant workers and so on. But I'm focusing on farm animal welfare mostly because it is one of the topics that has been omitted in the civilizing process, and I think we can see real connection between the civilizing process when we're talking about human relations, but also human and the non-human relations. So I think I will leave it at that here. I did quite a short presentation, and I think I've crammed a lot of information into it. Try not to read too much, because I tend to get carried away quite a lot, and I always get told like not so many slides and not so much talking. So I'm conscious of that. And yeah, I think in the future maybe we can kind of catch up on data analysis and all these different things that I'm doing. But for now, just this kind of just a sociological lens, I think, would be enough. So thank you very much for listening and for joining me today. So that's it. I think I can pause my share, stop share. There we go.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Adrianna. That was really interesting.
It was really quick as well. I know I get to just go like this. So
it was very clear. I respect a fast talker who speaks very clearly. It's good you laid it out.
I'm glad. I'm always conscious of this when I speak. I'm like, oh God, I speak way too fast. Especially when you know, watching yourself again. I'm like, oh my God, did I really say it that fast? But anyway.
No, it was good. It was good. I'm just waiting to see if anyone raises their hand for questions. But until we get some, because I don't think we have any yet, I was wondering, when you're talking about farmed animal welfare in Poland, where does this fit in with animal rights? So we kind of, when you talk about people starting to think about farmed animal welfare and fishers particularly, what kinds of things are they talking about? Do rights enter it at all, or is it very focused on a welfare argument?
So I think rights is not so much focused on. I know that there are, that's the thing about NGOs. You see, I came with this idea of, you know, how NGOs are working, and I thought they are pretty much all the same, right? Well, they are not. And all these different NGOs work for different things. They have different agendas and they have different ideas about how they want to improve farm animal welfare. And I think it's very important to distinguish between animal welfare and animal rights, because some organizations tend to work only for animal rights and just show that, yeah, okay, well, a cow does not need a right to vote, but it does need a right to, let's say, express its natural behaviors. But they tend to focus on kind of animal welfare side of things, also because the Polish government is very adamant about creating this contra-argument when it comes to farm animal welfare, especially fish welfare. So NGOs tend to kind of talk about this overcrowding and diseases when it comes to fish. And I tend to sometimes show pictures about how it, what it looks like in Poland when you just go and buy a carp and you just have this massive pond. You go there, you buy your carp, and then you pick it up in a plastic bag, and you kind of and you take it home and you put it in a bathtub, and then you take it, you kill it, and then you have your carp for your so-called meatless Christmas time. And I think the government has been talking about how, well, fish, they can breathe through their skin, so it's not a problem. Just put another plastic kind of bag inside that bag, like a plastic, I don't know, sometimes when you buy your oranges, you have that plastic net. You put that net and then you put it in that additional plastic bag, so you're creating more waste. Great. And then you take it, and apparently it helps your fish to breathe better. And I think these are the kind of weird arguments that NGOs have to tackle and they have to focus on. So I don't think, when I was speaking with NGOs and when I was doing my observations, I don't tend to kind of talk so much about animal rights, especially when it comes to fish, because there is this division between life on land and life in the sea, and that's why fish are so very much omitted in so many legislations and considerations. Yeah, definitely there is some talk about animal rights, but it's just these certain NGOs, when they are trying to talk about that, but they talk more about animal welfare. But more interestingly, they talk about human welfare. And I think these are the arguments that speak to people a little bit better than just animal welfare, because just talking about animal welfare and say, well, maybe kill this fish first, or don't transport fish and don't do this, don't do that, does not really appeal to people. When they say you will be healthier or it will be better for you if you do this for this particular animal, people tend to be a little bit more understanding. And I think NGOs are just realizing that it's just this animal rights argument is not enough. And even animal welfare argument is not enough. So it is a very complex issue, especially when it comes to Poland, because when I was talking about figurations, they are all unique discourses, and each country is a unique discourse, and each kind of relationship and interdependencies are all so diverse that's why it just takes so much, I don't know, time and energy to investigate, and that's why it has to be focused on just that one little figuration of, let's say, one or two countries at a time. So I hope it answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. I can see Erica has her hand up as well. Erica, did you want to ask your question?
If I could manage to unmute myself, sorry about that for the delay. I think it's a really interesting project, Adrianna, and I think Elias has a lot that can help us in illuminating our relationship with non-human animals and the way that changes over time. But there's, I don't know, I'm a bit worried about civilizing generally and the use of that concept. And I think there's a kind of tension in Elias himself. On the one hand, he says civilizing, it's all a social construct. We differentiate ourselves from those who we believe are less civilized than us. But on the other hand, I think he also thinks that it is a real process. So one of the things that worries me is that using the civilizing process can kind of reproduce that we're more civilized in the West, in Europe, because we have higher standards of animal welfare. So for Elias, he said, you know, you can use the civilizing process to talk about the civilizing of violence. He talked about the Holocaust actually after the civilizing process as a way in which violence was presented as civilized. So I just wondered if you could say something about, is there a tension with using the notion of civilizing, and is there a kind of tension actually in Elias's use of the civilizing process? Sorry, that was very long.
That's fine. Definitely, and I'm very happy that you're also interested in Elias, because not many people are aware of his work, and I don't tend to have a kind of big audience when it comes to that, unless I go to kind of these Elijah conferences and so on. But yes, it's definitely there's definitely a tension, and I think I wanted to mention that when I was talking about how people consider themselves more civilized, so-called Western societies, and colonizing other nations or other countries, and they say, well, you're primitive and you're barbarians. I think I have found that there is this big tension as well when people tend to be vegetarians or vegans, and they tend to consider themselves more civilized because they have this more view on animal welfare and animal sentience. So, look at me, I'm vegan, so I know more, so I am more civilized than you are. And I think there's definitely this tension between those groups. So yes, of course, and it's such a problematic thing, and I tend to fight with it quite a lot, and I'm not all like I didn't kind of come here just to talk about Elias and praise him, because I know that there's a lot of things which I don't agree myself with, and things like ecofeminism and stuff, which I am kind of fusing into the work, and I am not relying on him 100%. It's just kind of a lens that helps me maybe understand and develop some ideas about farm animal welfare governance and these human interdependencies. But yeah, definitely there are tensions. So
great, thank you. It's really interesting.
And Corey, you've got a question?
I just wanted to add on that, because my most recent book on Ireland, I looked at a little bit of the civilization theory, and really a lot of the early logics of colonizing spaces was not just that these people are not civilized and we need to introduce these laws of civilization, but it was also this idea that these people were animal-like, they were animalized themselves. So the act of colonization is not just trying to make people more civilized, but actually make them more human. And it's also kind of strange, a lot of these areas that were originally, because you just mentioned, Adrianna, about how vegans kind of feel like, oh, we're more civilized, but actually when colonization was taking place, it was sort of the reverse. So for instance, Ireland was very much so, I mean, not by any means completely vegetarian, but a very plant-based society, as many traditional societies were. And the British came in and said, look at these potato eaters, or they went into India and said, look at these rice eaters. Like, these are people who are weaker because of their more animal-like nature, because of the way that they eat. And so part of the civilization project was also, and I think David Nybert's work covers this very well, although I don't know if he specifically looks at Norbert's work, but basically coming in to introduce animal agriculture. And with the introduction of animal agriculture comes this kind of simultaneous animalization of the human beings who live there. So they're more primitive. And so colonization is therefore necessary, not just to get people more human-like, but get them to eat more animal products and transform their economy to be more speciesist based on animal labor. So there's so much amazing stuff with what Linda's over here calling them NORBs, orbitalized. So I was really excited to see you exploring this. Thank you.
So we're NORBs. Yeah, I didn't hear that before, so that's a good one. I think I have to pass it forward, if I may, just to the north. But yes, I really enjoy your point about that, because there's always so much to unpack when it comes to civilization and to kind of civilized ideas. But I think yeah, you've taken it a little bit further than I kind of wanted it to take, because I do not actually think about these kind of vegetarian and vegan ideas and their relations and how it all came about. So that was just kind of a point to say that the same way people consider themselves civilized and consider other barbarians, it is a similar kind of tension within, I think, this, well, I don't want to say community, but within vegetarians and vegans. But I like it how you have extended that point into something that can be unpacked, not by me, but definitely something to be done there. So thank you.
All right, I think that's probably about the end of our session. There's definitely a few more comments in the chat if you want to have a look through.